Next speaker tonight is Tim Hayward, Professor of Environmental Political Theory at the University of Edinburgh, where he is also Director of the Just World Institute. Tonight, Professor Hayward discusses the catch-all derogatory term conspiracy theory and posits that maybe being a conspiracy theorist is not such a bad thing after all. So please let's all put our hands together for Professor Tim Hayward.
Good evening. Just wait for this to load. It's strange that a professor of environmental political theory from Edinburgh is here talking about media on trial. I think it's fair to say this past 9 months, past 10, 11 months, I've learned as much as I did probably my first year of life. And it all started, thanks to Vanessa's friend, and then Vanessa herself, of course, for making me realise that our media were not entirely telling the truth about everything. Because I'm a professor, it hadn't quite dawned on me up until that point, because studying philosophers, they 200 years ago, is still quite a new idea in some ways for us. We take a while to catch on. So I could put myself in the place of people, probably unlike most of the people in this room, who are way ahead of me. Most of us are way behind you in understanding just how much we're being deceived. But the situation in Aleppo, I think, was quite a litmus test for a lot of people, because there you had two competing stories, and then you had immediately afterwards a test of which one was telling the truth. And that was a very significant moment for me personally, but I think also for the world, and clearly a very major historic turning point in all sorts of ways. So that's kind of prompted me being involved. I started doing blogging, which was, just letting off a little bit of steam, really. But it was found to resonate with quite a lot of people in the public, and they said, well, it's good that someone who's got credentials is saying this, because otherwise we get dismissed as crazy conspiracy theorists. So that's what I'm talking about this evening, because I'll explain as we go along. I've been writing a blog about this as well, but I'll, if I can get the technology, this thing, is it? Who's afraid of conspiracy theory? As mainstream media lose our trust, we as citizens have to decide who to believe. And independent journalists give us a choice. And at the moment, we have this choice because we can hear them speak, places like this, we can hear them speak on social media, and certain, I think, foreign TV channels still. But I wouldn't... I think we should be aware that we're enjoying this freedom of speech at the moment, and it's not something that has always been there, and it's not something necessarily that always will be there. And this is quite a disturbing thought. The journalists on the platform, this part and the second part, are all often called conspiracy theorists. That's something that we know if we just see what's said in the media. But what about the academics? And we have an ambassador, a former ambassador as well. I just want to show you that everyone is liable to be called a conspiracy theorist. I'm feeling... Sorry, we'll give some examples. There's Times journalist on Peter Ford. He is accusing him of endorsing conspiracy theory. Then we have a Times journalist on Piers Robinson, who refers to him as an academic in journalism, who turns out to be a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. He also touts obscure pro-Assad blogger. And there's a Guardian journalist on me. Well, a Twitter follower of his is advising him, because I had a little bit of debate with George Monbiot, someone I respect greatly, and that's why I wanted to have a debate with him. But this Twitter follower of his advised him, because he kind of disagreed with me, that I write for the conspiracy blog 21st Century Wire, which is represented here this evening, which also denied climate change, and I consort with Vanessa Beeley. My wife might be seeing this. We share a platform sometimes. But George Monbiot said this explains a lot. Now, this is just a casual tweet. It's not like a major treatise he's offering here. But it's just typical of the throwaway comments that people make. And ordinary people who might say something can get very easily dismissed and discouraged and disheartened when this kind of throwaway comment's made. I'm not saying that I do, but I can understand it can have an effect. I asked George what it explained. Then he becomes slightly weary because they've heard it all before. It's depressingly familiar to anyone involved in climate wars. People dismissing a weight of evidence that they're not even aware of. And I think that's a puzzling kind of attitude because I put it to him in a tweet back. Could he name actually a climate scientist who would accept this report as evidence of the Syrian government's responsibility? Now, this debate was about the Khan Sheikhoun chemical incident in April. And I'd make the point that where there'd been a rush to judgment on the part of all the governments very quickly that Assad was to blame, I said, well, that we don't actually have evidence really to establish that. And I think if you're taking a more systematic and more, academic approach, you would be reserving judgment. You'd be waiting to see where the evidence was leaving you. Well, George was saying, I judge a case by the evidence, which sounds good, wherever it might take me, which also sounds good. And from the start, the evidence has been compelling. From the start, before any investigations. How do you know before the evidence is even investigated? You just trust what you're told. So, my point would be, we've seen Robert, his presentation, the amount of sheer investigative forensic analysis he puts in. Robert isn't the only person doing this kind of work. He's made a particular focus on the saving Syria's children, but people are doing very serious kinds of investigation, including into the chemical attacks. As a result of my starting to blog, a colleague of mine at Edinburgh University, who apparently, it turned out, has been looking at these matters for some time, was in touch with lots of people with expertise in chemistry who'd been studying these attacks in Syria and raised very serious questions about the mainstream narrative on every single one of them, including this latest one. So, serious conspiracies require serious conspiracy theory. But the conspiracy deniers, they like to trivialize it. What you've got here is a picture which came from Bellingcat's debunking of anyone that raised any questions about that particular attack. And this article is saying what you have to believe in order for it to have been a false flag operation. And you see the picture there, it's various kinds of tinfoil hat to show all the kinds of weirdos and wackies that would believe these things. Well, actually, it's not for him to say what we need to believe because it's for people to arrive at their own hypotheses. And this is something that Paul McKeague, my colleague that I spoke of, helped me see. And he wrote some guest blogs on my blog, and he's using methods that were thought up by Bayes, adapted by Alan Turing. You may remember Alan Turing actually was good enough at figuring out probabilities to crack the Enigma code and turn the course of World War II. So he's using methods with some degree of robustness to look at the hypotheses. So you have a choice as a citizen to follow the authorized narrative and just accept it and be compelled from the start, or to have a look at what people who take a more critical method have to say. Now, I'm not trying to say that just because you have a more impressive method it means you're right. All I'm trying to say is that the people who are doing so-called conspiracy theory may have a point, and that point is worth taking seriously. And the thing about conspiracy is, if it was easily discovered, it wouldn't be a very good conspiracy, would it? So they have to be a little bit difficult. They have to seem improbable. That's the whole point of it. And that's where good old Sherlock Holmes comes in to remind us with his principle that actually the approach to take is a much more calm and rational one. Once you've eliminated the impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, it must be the truth. So that's sometimes called the Sherlock Holmes principle. It's actually a simplification. What the scientists do is the print becomes too small to read, but it's about weighing hypotheses and probabilities. But the point is essentially the same, that it can surprise you. You don't always assume that something's not happened just because it seems improbable. And in the nature of the case, conspiracies are supposed to seem improbable. Unfortunately, some of these false flag operations, when you think what these improbable explanations involve, it can be truly shocking and horrifying. That's the really scary thing, but that is what might be hidden. So my point is, I'm not saying that a professor from Edinburgh knows better than Nikki Haley in the United States. What I'm saying is that we do not know for sure either way until it has been properly investigated. The question's an open one. A right to question is protected as freedom of expression. And working as an academic, I feel particularly jealous in guarding freedom of expression. As a citizen, I think it's really important that we have freedom of expression. So, should governments try to disrupt our efforts? Should the media be complicit in such an attempt? Well, here's where I get disturbed, with my day job hat on, because there are actually academics who think conspiracy theories should not be protected under freedom of expression. We have here an example, perhaps a particularly egregious example, but this political philosopher, legal philosopher, is one of the most famous, influential in the world, Cass Sunstein. He wrote about conspiracy theories. He wrote about their causes, and he wrote about some cures that he proposed for them. But he's not just any philosopher. I can do my philosophizing all I like, and not many people pay much attention. Look whose ear he had. Look at two people's ears he has. In his writings on this subject, he asks the question, how can government dispel conspiracy theories? How can it stop people asking these questions, citizens doing these kind of investigations? That is essentially what I'm seeing he is asking here. And he has answers to this by enlisting independent groups to supply rebuttals, for example, which independent, if they're good, that sounds good, but look actually what happens in practice. One of my very first blogs was looking at Amnesty International reports on Syria, and I was very surprised at how those reports from around 2012 didn't conform or follow remotely the research methods that were laid down for Amnesty International. That's what it's supposed to be doing. As an academic, the kind of geeky thing you can do is you can see whether they're using the methods that they say they're using, and they simply weren't. And it was pointed out to me, well, that same year, Amnesty International USA, which was producing these reports, was being headed by this person, Suzanne Nossel. I think you can see on the board her pedigree. I think you can see how she is part of Sunstein's answer to the problem of what you do about people who don't follow the main line. You get in there and you supply it. And another strategy, which anybody who follows Twitter and perhaps Facebook to some extent as well, may have some knowledge of. I dare say people in this room have come across it. Cognitive infiltration, it's called, of groups that produce conspiracy theories. So if people start getting a little bit too close to the truth with their inquiries, you get people, trolls, astroturfers, all these other kinds of new species that we have, they come along and muddy the waters. Now, I'm not going to go into doing the typology or ethnography of all these kinds of individuals. What I want to do is just make a simple point as a political philosopher. If we live in a democracy, if we live somewhere where freedom of expression is actually valued, then we have a tradition, a set of beliefs which are very straightforward and clear. John Stuart Mill, the 19th century political philosopher, he set out these principles. Now, I'm not saying we should all be liberals, I'm not saying he was right about anything, but people that talk about this being a liberal democracy and being protected, if they disagree with what he said, they should have a reason for it. And he said the only reason that you should ever prevent freedom of speech is to prevent direct incitement of harm. And you shouldn't prevent people speaking at all if they're just publishing opinions in the newspapers, because however whatever you might think about it, however extreme you might find it, however wrong you might find it, if it's not actually provoking someone to do some harm, there are very many good reasons just to allow it to be said. So it's quite worrying when very indirect kinds of harm and threat are started to use as reasons to curtail freedom of speech. The idea of actually preventing people, actually infiltrating people who are trying to do the kind of thing that Robert's doing, for me, is abhorrent as a philosopher and as a citizen. And I think we need to be aware, we need to be recovering a sense of confidence. I see people say, on Facebook, for example, they've lost friends, they've even fallen out with members of their family because they've taken the kind of stance that people on this platform take with regard to matters of the truth. It's serious for lots of people. So I think, as an academic, the least that I can do is give support to people who's doing nothing other than simply seeking the truth. And because originally scheduled to follow me at this point was John Pilger, I thought it appropriate to have his photo here, but it's certainly in any case appropriate to echo the sentiment. Always look for the truth from the ground up, rarely from the top down. Journalists are never real journalists if they are the agents of power, no matter how they disguise that role. Real journalists are agents of the people.